En el aire.
Good evening and welcome to our conference, Symposium Socialism's Threat to America. We thank you for being a part of this telecast. It's our first telecast in English, and we hope you enjoy it. We thank you for being a part of it. I thank the great team of panelists. We can call it a dream team, maybe, if you want to. I'll introduce them in a while. I want to thank also all the people that shared our invitation and are sending it to different media outlets and platforms. We appreciate that. I've got to thank Jose Tarano, our technical producer, who facilitates all this transmission and all the work that we do. And always thank God for the ability, the facility of all that we have. Basically, tonight we're going to have, and I call it a dream team because I think it's most fitting for the subject. And I'm not going to be able to give a full list of all the accomplishments and all the things that this great team has done. So if I leave anything important out, please, they will. And I ask our panelists that, again, I will introduce in a while, that they go ahead and add on. It's just that, some of you I know more than others, and I, apologize if I missed anything. We have Jason Poblete. Jason is an attorney, but not just an attorney. He's been involved in the political arena for quite some time. He knows basically the ins and outs of Washington. He's been an expert witness on many Senate and professional committees. We really enjoy him being here. Alberto De La Cruz is the managing editor of Babalú blog, which I must say it does a great job in the English language to tell the truth about Cuba, its lack of freedom, and all that is relevant to that. He also produces documentaries and a whole host of other things, all in the benefit of not just a free Cuba, but also the principles of democracy in general. Joseph Hage, for some technical reason, we're having trouble. He's a political analyst and expert in the Middle East and in the field of terrorism. We hope that he'll join us in a while, but there may be some technical issues, and this is part of remote telecasting. Otto Reich is a diplomat. He's worked in the State Department. He's worked in other branches of the federal government. I always must bring this up, and I know, and I hope he doesn't get mad at me for doing this, but this is important because the Reagan doctrine essentially was it did away with the Truman doctrine of containment. The Reagan doctrine was a rollback principle. In other words, confronting a communism. Well, Otto Reich was a part of that important team that designed that successful strategy that brought down Soviet communism. So it really is a privilege. That's why I call this a dream team, because everybody that's on this this panel really understands the material. I'm really, really glad that you're all here. Basically, the subject matter. Well, why is it important? After all, USSR, which was the main agent of communist promotion, supposedly collapsed in 1990. However, communism has continued, but they were the primary motor of promoting communism. Typically, it was an underground movement, fringe groups, all of them working, again, in the shadows. Rarely would you see an open declaration of being a communist, much less a political figure. Yet this started to change in the political arena when we heard gross stupidities and oxymorons like a democratic socialism, which is really, truly a fallacy. It's a contradiction in terms and it's a whole fabrication. There's a big difference between social democracy and democratic social. Democratic socialism is non-existent. However, it has served as the guise to dupe the American public into a revolutionary movement. But it gets worse than that. Since May, basically Black Lives Matter has totally unearthed what's called critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is right out of the Frankfurt School's critical theory model. In other words, this is not just Marxism. This is cultural Marxism as Gramsci and the Frankfurt School designed it. It's one of the fronts that they exercise. This language is being displayed, its symbols, its strategic movement. This is happening in broad daylight. So it's gone from being marginal and fringe groups, whether underground groups that were during the 60s, the Black Panthers, they were marginalized. Well, this is not the case. They have ample funding, and it's not just the George Soros. But, and this is probably the most dangerous part, they are in control of a major US party, the Democratic Party. So the theme, socialism's threat to America, is real as far as, I can see that I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. Julio, I'm Shiling. I'm director of Patria de Martí. The rules are going to be, we're going to try to keep this program at an hour. We hope if we go over, it'll just be a little bit. We're going to go through different segments where each panelist will weigh in. And again, please feel free to disagree partly, totally. This is an open discussion, but one that has to be had because of, on a personal perception, the danger that socialism presents to America today as it's being openly expanded, talked about as if it was, and we would not hear these things about Nazism, we would not hear these things about anti-system ideology, yet we're seeing it and hearing it today. We're going to follow, and I see Joseph hasn't come in yet, so we're going to begin with Jason Poblete will please begin our discussion. Go ahead, please, Jason.
Well, thanks, Julio and Otto and Alberto. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight via this medium. And Julio, you kind of touched upon really the central theme of, I think, our discussion is that it's always been here. I think you can go back to the early 1900s, 1920s in America. It's gone through 5 phases, roughly. And from World War I to then we had the first Red Scare, and then we had the Popular Front and the New Deal. And then we had the second Red Scare in the 50s and the New Left and social unrest. And back in the 90s, post-Cold War, the anti-WTO movements. I mean, it's taken on very different manifestations. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that it's always been here. I think it's always going to be here. And we're going to have this challenge, at least for the next decade or two. One thing I love about President Trump, I call him the great disruptor. I think he's someone that we needed in Washington, both in the Republican and the Democratic Party. It's one of the reasons why some of us were supporting him from the very beginning, because we saw both parties. It was reaching a point where you really couldn't tell the difference. And I encourage our viewers, if they want to learn more about this modern thread of Marxism, to read Dinesh D'Souza's book. He does a wonderful job in the United States of Socialism, where he talks and breaks down in what we have today, the current strain of what's called identity socialism, practice of dividing the country into groups. And I think we saw that back in the 90s inside the Republican Party, where we were trying to stop identity politics. We were trying to try something different. And we hit a lot of walls. The good news is we had a Republican revolution. We started to turn that around. And we, for some reason, fell back, and we lost the majorities. And I think having someone like Trump come on the scene and disrupt the entire system has been a net good for the United States. And I think will continue to be a net good. But we have to remain vigilant. This is a process that's not going to end in 4 years or 8 years. It's always going to be with us. We jokingly refer to them, of course, as fellow travelers. they were quietly working in the 90s. And they thought that those of us that would try and say something that was big government or overregulation, or anytime we would try and point out, look, we shouldn't be growing government. We should be decreasing the size of government. We should be doing what Reagan was trying to do. We should be pushing power out of Washington, not growing Washington. A lot of Republicans and conservatives were scoffed when we tried that. And there were a lot of people in this town. I live in Virginia, and there's a lot of towns near me where billions have been made off the federal government. Well, that's not what the founding fathers had in mind. They didn't have in mind a super government that was telling the rest of the country how to do this. And in the pandemic, by the way, we have seen a great response where we've had the states become the laboratories, the first line, the front line defenders. And President Trump and his team deserve a lot of credit for that reorientation. We're seeing a lot of that reorientation across the board. I wish we had enough time to talk about it, but there's so many important things happening. The most important one, I think, is that we're disrupting how Washington does business. We're going to need another 4 years, I think another 4 plus 8 more probably, to really set the government on a better path to deregulation, smaller government, less taxes, less debt, less wars, and less globalism. The modern red thread, another good book, by the way, if you want to read a very good book, it's called The Red Thread by Diana West, a search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy, takes its form in globalism. Takes its form in, that's how they're coming after our country. They're coming after our Constitution. They're coming after our way of life. And I think we have to focus on that important struggle that we're having right here in our country, and make sure that we do exactly what we're doing now, talking about it, sharing ideas, and trying to come up with different strategies on coping with it. So thank you for hosting this. Thank you for having us together for this discussion. I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Jason. And I see Joseph Hage has just joined us. And Joseph, I told him I know we had spoken, and I know you were coming in on a flight. And I said, well, maybe he's still on the plane or something. I'm glad you were able to join us. Joseph and I had announced it earlier, is an expert on terrorism, which there's a commonality with socialism, almost synonyms. And the Middle East, he's a tried and true political commentator, multilingual. I'm glad you're part of what I call the dream team on this subject. So I'm really glad that you're here.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you.
We're going to be going around, in discussion. We're going to try to keep it, to an hour, so as a respect, not just to you, but also the audience. So, feel free to disagree with anything that anyone says. Jason, I mean, there's so much, and I know we can only touch bits and pieces, and I would love to, at another point, redo this, because there's consciousness really has to be elevated on this important subject. When the Soviet communism fell, the Marxist intellectual community decided that they had to embrace critical theory, because that was the way to go. That's sort of basically grievance studies. I mean, post-colonial studies, gender studies, all these are extensions, branches that come out of the Frankfurt School's critical theory. It's all between the conflict notion of Marxism. It is Marxism. And the radical left hates to think of cultural Marxism because it's true. In other words, where that's the dominant. So in American universities, the Berlin Wall falls, Soviet communism falls, but universities embrace this grievance studies campaign to rescue Marxism. And we're seeing the result now. So it's important to, have these discussions. And in a certain aspect, there's a silver lining to this, basically, as I see it, a Marxist insurrection. And that is that Black Lives Matter has introduced out in the open certain language and concepts that was alien to most Americans. Now it isn't anymore. I think it's the job of those that love democracy to really, bring out and show what Marxism is, its danger, and the way that it works. Alberto De La Cruz, you're up next, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Julio, for having me on. I'm very happy to be here, and it's great to see Jason and Otto, and pleasure to meet you as well, Mr. Hage.
Nice to meet you.
I just wanted to say, going back to some points that you just made, Julio, and I was thinking about this. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I remember thinking, wow, this is it. Finally, everybody will understand that communism and socialism does not work. And, finally, we're rid of this scourge on society, 100 million dead, billions enslaved. Unfortunately, we did manage to get them off the world stage, but they just went into hiding. And I think that's something that you touched upon, Julio, that they just regrouped. And there's an investment that was made years before the collapse of the Soviet Union that was made by the communists to infiltrate and basically take over the educational systems in the universities in the U.S. And I have to give them credit for their patience. They just waited for those seeds that they planted to grow. They nurtured it. They watered it. They gave it fertilizer. And we're seeing now the product of, I believe we're seeing now the product of what they planted 30, 40 years ago. And we see it now in the critical race theory and in Black Lives Matter. We see it in all these movements where it's very similar to communism, where you have a very positive, for lack of a better term, a very positive message, equality and end of racism, end fascism, where you get this large group of people to support you, and they really have no idea what they're really supporting. And it's how socialism works, because if socialism comes out and says the true goal is that we're going to take over everything, we're going to control everything. The hierarchy, the party elite are the ones that make all the money. The rest of you are slaves. Nobody's going to pick socialism, but they call it equality. They call it social justice. They call it all these things. And they get this large group of people to follow them, not knowing what they're following. And it's like the old adage about the frog in the boiling pot. By the time the frog figures out the water's boiling, it's too late. It's dinner. So I think it's important that we recognize what's going on, what's happening today. Looking at it from a purely strategic perspective, I think they're too soon. They're trying to take too much too soon, and you have an entire country or you have a large swath of the country that's not listen to this message. And I think they either one of two things: either they felt this was their last opportunity, or this was their best opportunity to do something. But when you see what's happening in Portland, you see what's happening in Seattle, in New York, in Chicago, and these different cities, and you see this, all of a sudden they're going straight to violence, they're going straight to intimidation, they're doing things that any person that with a modicum of common sense would say, you know what, this does not make us attractive to the rest of America. And it feels, I think they feel they have an advantage, and I think they're completely wrong. And I'm happy for that. I'm kind of glad they're showing their cards early in the game, as opposed to later on, as they've done in Europe, where they've kind of waited till they've taken over more of the institutions and have more control, and then start showing their cards when it's too late for them to be able to actually do anything about it. So I'm kind of glad they're doing it now, and we're able to deal with it. But I think the threat of socialism is never truly going away, because of the one factor that socialism never takes into account, and that is humans crave power and they crave control over others. And socialism is just as susceptible to that as capitalism, as any other ideology. The difference being socialism kills people to get it. And I think we're always going to have that as long as you have a human nature to want to have power and complete control.
Thank you, Alberto. I mean, you brought up a lot of points. And I sense the principle of the unmasking of the Marxist movements. Again, I think it's beneficial in that it forces the citizenry to take serious its threat, and they basically see it, the threats to the Second Amendment and a whole bunch of other things. And it's important to understand that this was Barack Obama's objective by a different methodology. He was basically following the Fabian socialist methodology of doing it, that long march through the institutions. And I think you gave that, you touched upon that. Black Lives Matter is like a grenade that has exploded. I mean, these are the radical Jacobins that, think they're ready to storm the Bastille, but they're unaware that this is what's given Trump the push he needs for the victory. And I bring Trump into this because, on a personal note, I do think you can think what you want about his style or whatnot, but he is the wall of containment as far as I'm concerned, to challenge. And that's why, to challenge this red wave, but not red in the Republican sense, but red in the socialist sense of against America, that began on his inauguration day, basically 4 years ago. So, Joseph, please give us your we're really glad you made it.
Thank you, Julio, for the invitation. Gentlemen, nice to meet all of you. I had met Ambassador Reich before in one of the studios in Miami, and I'm a fan too of his statements. Julio, as you know, that I don't know who to give the credit, that a person who said after the fall of the Soviet Union, or basically the wall of Berlin particularly, that all these people are coming back into our societies under different names and organizations, be it environmentalists, human rights, social rights, all the rights, and whatever names they want, umbrella they want to use to go with. But specifically, that person said at that time that the formula of the haves and have-not is always workable on the ground to incite violence, to incite hatred, to incite, and so on. So what we're seeing today on the ground in the United States, I think it's not the last bullet they have, but they're gonna try it to see how big of a scale they need in order to implement whatever they want. They call it Black Lives Matter. Doesn't matter what they call it. We know what they want. They call it Antifas. Doesn't matter what the name is. That we know what they want. So the bottom line is, yes, institutions, from personal experience and from my son's experience, we understand that universities are a good fertile ground to incite those ideas. But when that person goes out on the street and then is faced with reality, then that's when they think that life is not as easy as I thought. Then the professor was right. And I don't see, as I tell my son, I don't see which holy book you read that life is so easy without working hard for whatever you want to earn. So then that's when the discussion starts, that in order for you to go forward, you don't need to take from someone else in order for you to succeed. You can succeed, and whoever else has, he can keep them. But this is not the message that's going softly and smoothly on national media, on the internet. The network, the social media did not help at all, because now we have voices that otherwise would not have the opportunity to spread the benefits of quote unquote socialism and the benefits quote unquote anything that's really Marxist or socialism or communism. But then now they have more outreach. I mean, I was watching what happened in Chile last year until the pandemic started, and I was like, this is typical ABC of whatever can happen in a country where the leftists want to storm the street, storm the station, terrorize the population, and then people start looking at whoever is in charge, that like, this is not the good guy that we need another good guy, and then they show up all of a sudden to solve their problem by taking charge. And that's when we fall into the trap of whatever communism or socialism is spreading. So President Trump was, for me, was the dam that broke, because President Obama was very subtle. He's a good speaker. He's a preacher, and he did a very good job of doing whatever he did on the international level as well. Because if we look at what he did in Egypt, in Libya, in Turkey, where the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, with the same principle that the haves and the have-not, they have the power, we don't have it. They have more money, we don't have it. They hate socialism, they don't mention it, but it's the same formula. It works for everybody. So now we have still loose Erdogan in Turkey spreading the Muslim Brotherhood theory around the area, and he's dividing now the Mediterranean between him, the Greeks, the French, the Italians, and everybody. He wants a part of it between the haves and the have-not. That's how he gathered people behind him. But now he's destabilizing Eastern Europe between yesterday, what's happened last week, until now, what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This is a destabilizing matter that he's working on. And then we're going to have the same people take over. And then the only formula for them to control the crowd is either by force or by a popular vote. And then socialism will install itself either under the umbrella of the military or either under the umbrella of a fake parliament that they can spread it. Hopefully, this dam that broke in the United States, where everybody is seeing what's underneath, that the election of President Trump, like Julio just said, that whether we like it, we like his manner, we don't like his manner, but at least he represents those principles for which the United States stands for. So this is our objective. I mean, at least my objective is to stand for whatever this country stands for. And like many before me said it, because if the democracy as we really like it, as we really want it, and then the free economy, if it breaks here in the United States, we don't have anywhere else to go. I see the other one.
Thank you, Joseph. You touched upon many things. I want to just pull out the observation and the comparison, the analogy with Chile, and you're absolutely right. Which, as we see the movement of attacking churches, of attacking property, there it began over, they hiked subway prices, and that was the license for this. In this case, I mean, you have an incident, an isolated incident, which once due process concludes in the courts, we'll see really how much negligence and where the responsibility really lies on the death of George Floyd. But this is not about racial matters. This is about promoting revolution, just as it is in Chile, as you mentioned. And I mean, it's not a coincidence that they are following the same game plan. I mean,
and they did last week in Colombia. If you follow the same,
absolutely. I mean, you
manual.
Can look. This blueprint is exercised everywhere. So the way they come in, the way they're brought in with trucks, buses, the mode of movement, how they shield themselves. I mean, this is an opportunity, as far as the way I see it, for Democrats to really, really take action and take notice, because I believe it is much more proper for a defense of democracy with the enemy clearly in front of you than under the guise of Democrats when they're really not. Otto, please give us your insight.
Well, thank you very much, Julio. Let me start by quoting my favorite political philosopher, who was also a practitioner, and the person who I believe saved the Western world when it was threatened by National Socialism, a form of fascism, meaning the Nazi threat in the 1930s, and that was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill defined socialism this way: socialism is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. I have been an admirer of Churchill since I was about 10 years old, and I asked my father, who was an Austrian refugee from Europe, from the war, if he had any heroes, and he thought for a few seconds, and he says, yes. If I have a hero, it would be Winston Churchill, because he stood alone against the Nazis when most of the Western world wanted to avoid looking at the threat. There's a lot of people in the Western world who want to avoid looking at the threat of socialism today, and not the socialism of Sweden or Denmark, but Marxist socialism, the socialism that we see, for example, in this hemisphere. We don't have to go very far, in Cuba, 90 miles away, or in Venezuela, both countries in which I have lived, and in Venezuela, where I worked as the U.S. ambassador. Now, quickly, why does socialism fail? I think it's because it's very simple. It goes against human nature. Human nature dictates that people have what is called, what I like to call, enlightened self-interest. They want to improve their lot. They want to have a better life for themselves and their families and for their children, and to leave a legacy. Socialism does not permit that. Socialism controls all the means of production. You have a self-appointed, in most cases, they're not elected. You have a self-appointed group of people who take over not only the means of production, but all of the instruments of power in a nation. Again, look at the examples of Cuba and Venezuela. I know there's a lot of people looking at this, watching this seminar, who know about Cuba and Venezuela. Why is so? It fails. Socialism fails because it goes against that human nature that says that people work best when they work for themselves. And then if you have a reasonable amount of taxation and you have a limited role for government, you can take care of the other people who are not able to take care of themselves. Why is socialism dangerous? Precisely because it fails. When it fails, you have a situation like what you have in Cuba or what you have in Venezuela. Cuba before Castro was in the top 3 places in socioeconomic indicators in the entire Western Hemisphere. Income per capita, doctors per capita, hospital beds per capita, level of actually the lowest infant mortality in all of Latin America before Castro. It's of course part of the personality of socialism is that it takes credit for things that it does not do. In fact, it lies about it. One of the big lies in Cuba that a lot of its acolytes in the United States or Europe say is that Cuba has practically eliminated infant mortality. First of all, it not only is it not true, because it has the highest levels of abortion in Latin America. So they eliminate about 40% of all embryos before they're born, and any embryo that has the slightest possibility of not being born normally is aborted. But also, Castro inherited the #1 position in Latin America in terms of infant mortality. That's just one example. So this failure of the system leads to the failure, the following of the socialist economic policies lead to the failure of economic output, which leads to shortages. There were shortages. I was still living in Cuba in 1960 when the rationing was put in, and it wasn't put in because there were shortages. The rationing caused the shortages. And that was a method that the communist government established in order to control the population. If the population had to worry when they got up in the morning with how to feed their families, they didn't have time or energy to plot against the government. And that's the other thing that happens in these socialist governments like Cuba and Venezuela. And I could mention dozens of others. What happens is, as the economy collapses, as shortages increase, people become angry and they protest. So the government, of course, which believes that the people are wrong because they are right. After all, they're socialists and they're true believers and they're ideologues. So they act against the population. They repress the population. Again, this is the same pattern that unfortunately I lived through it in 1959 and 60 in Cuba. I lived through it to some degree as when I was in the State Department and Chavez came in and then Maduro, and I've been watching it, and it's the same pattern. They repress the people. Of course, the people then produce less. They begin to leave in droves, mass migration. That's another characteristic of these socialist governments. Mass migration. The economy continues to collapse. There's a vicious cycle, a spiral actually, that leads to more shortages, more repression, more exodus, and you find these basket cases like Cuba and Venezuela. In Venezuela today, there are shortages of water, of electricity, of food, of medicine, of housing. What's amazing is Venezuela, when I was ambassador, Venezuela was the third largest exporter of oil to the United States. Today, Venezuela has to import oil from Algeria and other places. It has no gasoline. Here's a country that has actually the largest deposit of oil, if you include the heavy crudes, in the world, and it cannot produce enough gasoline for its people. Milton Friedman, the great American Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, if you put the socialists in charge of the Sahara Desert, very soon you'll have a shortage of sand. And Cuba and Venezuela and the other socialist countries are examples that Milton Friedman was right. What we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that in view of all of these examples that we've seen around the world recently, we're seeing them today, when people in Venezuela are eating out of garbage cans, when 20% of the population of Venezuela has left on foot the neighboring countries, when 10% of the people of Cuba fled Cuba, according to the U.S. Coast Guard, about 80,000 Cubans have died in the Florida Straits trying to leave Cuba in the last 60 years. That doesn't include the people who actually made it. 80,000 have died. How can anybody think that socialism works anywhere? Let me just stop there. I could go on, but I think that I think you get my sort of my opinion of socialism from just those remarks.
Well, Otto, no, I mean you're right on the, you're right on the money with what you're saying. But I've got to begin with what you said about your quoting Winston Churchill and your admiration of which I share the admiration towards Winston Churchill, as I'm sure other members of the panel. And just as a note, Barack Obama took out the statue of Winston Churchill from the White House.
That's
Donald
right.
Trump brought it back. This is important because it's not just the figure, the really the lone European figure, relatively speaking, of someone of stature that stood up early on, that warned about the danger of attempting a peaceful coexistence treaty with Nazi Germany and foretold the danger of pacting with, making treaties with the Soviet Union. But Winston Churchill represents an embracing of Western civilization and a whole host of moral values, Judeo-Christian values, that socialism is at war with. So when Barack Obama removes the statue of Winston Churchill, it's not just because he doesn't like the guy, that he had good humor and told good jokes. No. He was doing it for deep ideological and moral reasons. And Janos Kornai, the Hungarian economist, said, socialism could only breed economies of shortage. This is undeniable. But to me, this is empirical evidence. You cited figures of Cuba and Venezuela, and they're absolutely true. These are undeniable. They're public record. It's just a matter of looking at that, and it's indisputable. But when you add the over 1 million, probably 120 million, rather, of casualties as a result of communist rule, and how anyone is not embarrassed to death to be able to defend such a monstrous system, shows us, unfortunately, the success of Marxism by way of its cultural penetration, and the desperate need for those that are defending liberty and democracy to highlight the deficiencies and challenge this. And this is why I think this is a great opportunity and an obligation to continue this fight, as Jason said, far beyond the Trump presidency and the hopeful, which I believe will happen, the victory in the 4 more years. This does require a cultural and moral renewal to meet this challenge. We're going to go through another cycle now. So please, Jason.
Yeah,
you're up at bat.
Yeah, Julio, I wanted to I've been listening to all the great comments of I want to use the example of China to capture something that Otto was talking about and the others talked about in some form or another. But to talk about what's happened here in Washington, right here in what I call the belly of the beast. And we have to see the battle with China. We for decades here in Washington kept telling ourselves, if we engage with China and we try and be kind to China and we trade with them, things will go better. Well, some of us never believe that. I'm very proud that I've never been to communist China. I don't think I've been to any communist country because I don't believe engagement with communists works. And the Chinese model is a classic example of a massive failure in foreign policy, of massive failure in readjusting our foreign policy to the new post-Cold War mindset. I'm not sure what the Chinese did or didn't do to us because of pandemic. We have to answer that question. I can tell you that for too many decades, we coddled China. We pretended nothing was happening in China while they're committing genocidal acts, while they're doing horrible things to their own people. We bought their cheap goods. Everybody was living great, buying cheap goods. We have to change that behavior. We have to bring jobs back to America. We got to bring jobs back to the hemisphere. It requires very tough, like I said at the beginning of my remarks, a reawakening, a great disruption that I think President Trump and his team have managed to do that. And I want to bring in somebody. We talked a lot about communists and what they believe and don't believe. I think Whittaker Chambers, if any of you haven't read his book, Witness, I think your viewers should read this book. I've read it many times, and he encapsulates it very well. The communist vision is a man without God. It's a very selfish ideology because they put themselves above God. The United States, we believe our rights, our fundamental rights that come from God, and the government's there to do it as we instructed to do to protect those fundamental rights. We have to fight for that. That's the battle. That is the battleground. I think that's the choice this November. There's 2 paths we can go. We want a foreign policy that's going to coddle the communists, or do we want a foreign policy that's going to tell them access to the U.S. market is a privilege, not a right, and we got to push these people out. And I'm glad President Trump is doing that. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner, has a quote that I keep very close by, and I read it frequently, and it talks about neutrality. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. And sometimes we have to interfere when human lives are in danger. And wherever men and women are persecuted, and this is the important part, because of their race, religion, or political views, at that moment, that person becomes the center of the universe. We can't keep turning away from these horrible things that communism and socialism has done to people, that continues to do to people. They're committing mass crimes that hopefully someday we can hold them to account for what they have done. And the battleground begins, I believe, this November, when we have a clear demarcation between the globalist wing of the American political elite that includes Democrats and Republicans. Unfortunately, there are some Republicans that believe in that mindset, or a nationalist mindset. I think that's a positive thing, where countries pursue their national interests, their security interests, their economic interests first. And in our case, of course, it's defense of our Constitution and our way of life. And I think it's a unique, I think people are coming here not because life is so horrible here. And I think all of these left-wing radical groups like the Antifa people, you know, the modern age brown shirts and black shirts, if they don't like it here, they can leave. And I think they have to be shown the door. There's a lot of people that want to come to our country, that want to protect our Constitution and our way of life. I want to welcome those people here. But part of this reawakening of this American exceptionalism in the body politic of U.S. politics is this reorientation, these tough questions that we need to ask ourselves. Who are our allies going to be, and who are the adversaries going to be, and make those decisions about our engagement in the world accordingly.
Thank you, Jason. I mean, you know, I'm so glad you touched upon China, because China is, and this brings to mind, I believe I happened to be sitting with Otto during I think it was a conference here in Miami, an ASCII conference, and there was an Obama official that he was the speaker at the luncheon, and basically, you know, we sort of hit him with the contradiction, the moral contradictions of this policy. And you touched upon this, the policy of engagement, and, you know, the policy of détente, which is a complete failure, Engagement, the notion that through economic interdependence, you can bring about democracy, that only works in authoritarian regimes, In other words, you were able to get Taiwan to eventually go into democracy. You were able to get Egypt. You were able to get Brazil. You were able to get Greece. Well, that's because these were authoritarian regimes. But Marxist regimes, totalitarian regimes, it's the total opposite effect. What you do is you consolidate the dictatorship to a point that they prosper. And China is, unfortunately, a great example. And they've done this at the expense of the American working class. In other words, the price is not just one of national security, which that's important of itself, but the post-World War II notion that through economic interdependence, we can all be friends and we'll all become a democracy.
Julio, and it's their own people too. They treat their own people like commodities. Those are not human beings to them. They are people to be used.
Absolutely, but no communist country really cares about their people.
That's right.
You know, this is mainstream in communist countries, and the war on God. This is fundamental, because socialism is a political religion, and the idea of God, the idea of the family, the idea of the middle class, the idea of nation, all these are enemies of the socialist ideological weight. So, you know, this has got to be challenged, and we see this, and this is why they're crazy over Donald Trump. And when we see Obama's engagement policy with Cuba, just to put an example, we see where the moral issue was never at question. In other words, I mean, could you believe, I mean, not just that this is a regime that commits crimes against humanities, but it committed the wholesale theft, the major wholesale theft of American properties more than any other in history. It holds the record of having been the biggest robber of American property in history, and yet none of this was discussed.
You know, Julio, briefly before the other speakers jump in on that, I think one of the most outrageous things President Obama did, and I'd be curious to hear Ambassador Reich's observation about this, was to coddle Raul Castro, who in my opinion belongs in a cell somewhere, in a bunker frankly, he belongs in Camp X-ray in the opposite side of Guantanamo. And they somehow went over there and embraced this man as if nothing that he ever did mattered. And that was such a poor use of the instrument of great power that is the office of President of the United States. So there's a lot of horrible things he did with Cuba engagement, but to me, that was the worst one. And he has, frankly, a lot to be held to account for, not just because of what he did there, but what he failed to do there, because he did not hold those people to account. In fact, he mocked a lot of dissidents, a lot of political prisoners, a lot of people who died, including American citizens.
Yeah. Alberto, please weigh in.
No, the Obama engagement with Cuba is something that really bothered me, and there's something that came out just recently. Some dissidents that met with Obama when he was visiting in Cuba came out and said that what Obama told them while he was there speaking with them was he wanted a model close to what you have in Burma or Myanmar, whatever name you want to use for it. But that's basically a system where the people in power get to remain in power, and they sort of let you have a little bit of extra freedom. And that was such a slap in the face, such an insult to the thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Cubans that have rotted in gulags and political prisons in Cuba, the hundreds of thousands that have been beaten, the hundreds of thousands whose families have been destroyed, to come back and come to them and say, listen, you just got to accept it, and I'm going to get you a little bit of extra, maybe an extra chicken drumstick on your plate, but this is what I'm gonna, this is all you're going to get, as if Obama or the president, any president of the United States has a say in what the Cuban people can do. Now, I don't think the United States has any business invading Cuba and liberating the Cuban people. But by the same token, neither does the United States have any business empowering and supporting and giving a lifeline to a regime that's oppressing people in Cuba. So to me, that was something that really, the Cuban in me comes out, me chocó. It really bothered me about the entire thing, because it was all a ruse. It was, I believe Obama's a true believer. I think he's one of these people that really does believe in that whole idea, that whole socialist left-wing idea. I think he's honest about it. I think he believes in it. And I give him credit for that, because he never really, because I think it's honest. I think he's wrong. He's dreadfully wrong, but he's a true believer. And I really think Obama believed that the U.S. was doing Cuba wrong by the sanctions and the treatment of the Castro dictatorship. And to make it worse, I really think he believed Fidel Castro liberated the Cuban people from the quote unquote, U.S.-backed dictator, which anybody who reads a history book would know that if that U.S.-backed dictator would have gotten the arms that the U.S. held back from him, would have had a better chance of fighting off that revolution. But that's a totally different topic and totally different thing. But the truth of the matter is, what Obama did in Cuba, or the way I see it, what Obama did in Cuba was not only the wrong foreign policy, was not only rewarding and legitimizing a murderous and slave regime that has slaves, but it's also an apartheid regime that blocks Afro-Cubans from having any positions of power, from making any gains in there. And I think he did that because he thought he was doing the right thing, because he thinks America is bad. America, that has a black president is bad, and Cuba, that's run by the direct descendants of a Spanish colonizer, is good.
That's right.
Which I found mind-boggling. But this is something that we have to keep in mind when you think about socialism and you think about the people that back socialism. This is where they're coming from, where they see a country that elected a black president as racist, and a country like Cuba, which has been run for 60 years by a lily white European descendants of Spanish colonizers, as the epitome of racial justice. It's hard to discuss these things with them, because if they can have such a warped sense of reality, how can you reason with them? So this is something that has to be kept in mind. You cannot really reason with someone who believes something like that, because they have been so. And this goes back to what I mentioned, and others of you have mentioned as well. It's what has been planted in their minds throughout school and universities, and what they've been told, where they believe these things. I've spoken to people who, straight out of college, who believed Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat, and they had a textbook that said otherwise, but that's what the professors taught them. So it's not an easy battle that we have, but it's one that we have to continue fighting, because if not, eventually they get to everybody and we become the minority. And that's what we can't have. The truth cannot become the minority and the lie become the majority. The truth has to maintain itself and always be the majority.
Thanks, Alberto. Now they're calling Lincoln a lot worse than Democrat, which is pretty bad. I mean, now they're calling him, he's become the enemy for many reasons, because of his belief in Western values and God and the position he took. I mean, you would think that, and this just shows you that this has nothing, all this insurrection has nothing to do with racial thing. I want to mention, we're getting great comments from Ernesto De Varganes. I really appreciate it, and I hope some of the other panels are getting a chance to read some of his comments. He's really bringing in good comments. The drug trade and a whole bunch of other issues. That the truth is, I do believe in the notion of international solidarity. I mean, no major historical process has happened without it. I mean, the reason that fascism was defeated in Europe was because there was an international movement. South America, Central America, well, their independence had to do with, they'd have to thank Napoleon Bonaparte, for that. And the United States, 90% of the weapons that Washington's great army used was paid for by France. And France not just paid for it, but they were physically involved in battles that changed the tide of the war. So, if those that say, well, this is just an issue for Cubans or just an issue for Venezuelans, I mean, it's part of it, a strategy, the game plan to leave the regimes there. And Obama never had regime change in mind. He was looking to facilitate the survivability of the Castro regime, as far as I'm concerned. Please, Joseph, let us have your insight. And again, thank you for Ernesto De Varganes for his insightful comments.
I couldn't agree more with Jason that appeasing China, Russia, Iran, all these countries, and one of the mistakes that I've seen in the State Department since I came to this country in 1990 is they think that appeasement is a solution for every problem, and one of the things that I deducted sometimes from those who I spoke to, including like Assistant Secretary of State all the way down, that when they speak about appeasement, they think that it is really, we can come to an agreement somehow, because they are thinking from their point of view. They never put what the other part is thinking and try to match those demands. What I want is completely different what he wants. I need to put myself in his shoes in order to negotiate with myself a United States. And that's where always it fails. There's no way that it's gonna succeed. United States did not succeed with Iran, it did not succeed with China. The only time it succeeded not appeasing was Ronald Reagan, the great president, against the Soviet Union. If he had appeased, we probably would have seen still the Soviet Union alive today. And to quote the great Winston Churchill, who said to Chamberlain, you went to negotiate, you lost the negotiation, and you're going to have the war anyways. So it does not work at all in politics, not with socialism, not with anyone that has a kind of, I don't know if it is hatred, but like disbelief that our system of human rights, small government, etc., is functioning and it works, but they still insist on doing what they did over and over again. China tried, open economy. They have the whole, but then when the people start waking up, but they never let go of of socialism, of communism in politics. So when people start waking up, want it more and more, that's when they started reprimanding them all over again. So we're not gonna get anywhere with appeasement. And Alberto mentioned over and over history, and this is another clue for me that a new generation, probably, I don't know, 1 or 2 generation, that has no knowledge of general education, general knowledge, and history. So like if ask someone about Abraham Lincoln, he's a Democrat, you can ask about someone about Joseph Stalin, they never heard of his name. I mean, this is the books are not made now for this new generation or the one before to learn anything about the past. And that's how they can guide them to go to the street and start burning, screaming, asking, wanting all this, because they don't know better. Their parents did not, because we all know when you're young, your parents don't know anything. So much less their parents are gonna be educating them. So the education system is not helping. Parents cannot do it. So they get at an age where they have no knowledge of the past and they believe in what they're hearing. And that's where we always fail.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm glad you brought in under the banner of appeasement, which I think there's probably a consensus in this panel about that. The issue of Iran, where we see that this truly, the ideological government of Barack Obama did have a mission. I mean, this was a mission-oriented presidency, and Iran was part of the scheme that totally discombobulated certain weighing mechanisms in the Middle East. And it's not a coincidence that Iran is a major player in the socialist regimes in Latin America with the Hezbollah militias and the part that they have in the drug business, which is a major funding for hemispheric socialism. So, all these things are interconnected, and we could see the Obama administration focusing on precisely assisting these regimes in every way that he could. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. And the education, I mean, I was happy when President Trump rolled back the critical race theory that they were indoctrinating federal employees with. I'm glad that's supposedly gone, and that he's bringing back civic education. This is important. You need, when you don't have an ideological star guiding a democracy, it's going to be filled with political religions that are anti-system, and this is where we've gone. I mean, this is, I think, what has been alluded to here, as far as the why in universities they are becoming basically bastions of indoctrination on citizens to overthrow precisely the government that facilitated the lifestyle that they enjoyed. Otto, Europe, I bet, please.
Okay, just very briefly, because I know you wanted to finish in 1 hour, and I think we're
Yeah.
look, the reason why the Obama policy failed on Cuba is precisely because of what we've been talking about. It was a policy of appeasement. It was not a policy of promoting American values. In fact, the Obama opening to Cuba was a betrayal of American values in that it was one of the very few occasions that I can think of. I want to say the only time when the United States sided with an oppressor against the oppressed. The people of Cuba were told by members of the American embassy. The dissidents were told, and I've had some of these dissidents tell me since they've left Cuba after the opening, the quote historic opening, as so many academics and journalists, so-called journalists, called it, that they were told by American embassy officials, figure out how you can make a deal with the government because you cannot count on with the Cuban government because you can't count on the United States anymore. I mean, that to me is a betrayal, and it's the kind of behavior that I did not expect even from an Obama administration. Obama did the Cuba opening because at the end of his terms, the 2 terms, he had no foreign policy successes. In fact, he gave a speech in September of 2016 at the White House, 2 months before the election, in which he said very proudly, he says, people say this administration doesn't have foreign policy successes. Well, we have 3. And he named Iran, Cuba, and Myanmar. It's incredible. Iran, we all know, is a complete failure. He gave the Iranian terrorist government $150 billion to sign an agreement that was favorable to Iran and not favorable to the U.S. And Myanmar, as was briefly mentioned here, he sided with a military government against the people. And by the way, that agreement has completely fallen apart, and Myanmar is once again a dictatorship. And in the case of Cuba, as I just said, he sided with the oppressors against the oppressed. That's Obama's own definition of 3 foreign policy successes. It's really shameful.
Well, thank you, Otto. What I'd like to do before closing, and I just want to bring to mind Laos, which is a self-declared communist country. Obama wanted to give it a preferable trade status and access to access to government funds for trade, that he declared it non-communist, even though they explicitly call themselves a communist republic. He did that so that they can get preferable treatment in trade and access to credit. This was done this is one of his first acts as president. So this has been a steady stream towards socialism that currently is out in the open, and that's why we're having events like this and people such as yourselves to bring about and elevate consciousness in the U.S. public. I'd like to go real quick, if I may, around the table just one more time. Sort of give your final thoughts, and then we'll close for tonight. Jason, please.
Well, Julio, thank you, and thank the group for sharing some time this evening on a Monday. Please go vote in November. These are important, extremely important elections. I know we always say that, but as we said at the start of this program, I really believe that, and I've been involved in politics a long time, that this is a paradigm election that's going to potentially reshape the path of the nation for decades to come. This is not just about the White House. This is about the Senate. This is about the House. And we need you to get out there. Every vote does count, and don't take it for granted. We are choosing between 2 different paths. We're choosing a path of more statism and socialism, which is what they represent on the left, the Democratic Party, which I believe is the Socialist Party of the United States. You can call it what you want, but that's what they are. And the party of individual rights, the American Party, the party of free markets, the party of rule of law, the party of preserving our great heritage, our great institutions. And I think we need to get out there and show the left that we're not scared of them. They can engage in all these scare tactics all they want, but there are more of us than there are of them. And we're ready. We start to take back our country, and we're going to start keep that going the next 4 years.
Thank you, Jason. Alberto?
Yeah, Julio, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be with you and such a great group of people. And I just want to say something from a personal experience perspective. My parents came to this country from Cuba as refugees with nothing, and they were able to be successful. When I say successful, I mean fend for themselves, be able to have a house, a car, put a roof over our heads, food on the table, and give us the opportunity to have a life that's better than the life that they had. And when you look at socialism, socialism has a century-long, 100-year-long history of failure, and basically 1 million deaths per year, over 100 million, some say up to 120 million, as you mentioned, Julio. And if you notice what the socialists say, everything that this country has done, that did for my family, it did for the 2 million Cuban refugees that came here, and for the millions of other refugees that have been able to come to this country and have success and be able to live a better life in freedom and make their lives better. That's what socialists say is wrong with America. And that's why you see them always siding with the Castros of the world, the Maduros of the world, the Iranians, the Khomeiniist regimes of the world. That's why you see them siding with them, because they cannot provide an example of success in what they do. So all they can talk about is how horrible we are. But the truth of the matter is, from personal experience and from the experience of my family, not just my parents, my aunts and uncles, grandparents, everybody that came here, friends of the family, this country afforded us opportunity and it afforded us freedom to be able to lead a better life. And the same socialists today are telling us how horrible that freedom and that opportunity is, that we should be more like Cuba, that we should be more like Iran. And it's amazing to me, because that's their argument. But even more amazing is that some people are actually buying into it, because as they tweet or they post on Instagram from their iPhones, from their $1,000 iPhones at Starbucks, drinking an $8 coffee, they say America is unfair. And America doesn't give them opportunity. America does not give them a fair shot. And that's just amazing to me. So keep in mind that they are not fighting from a position of strength. They're fighting from a position of weakness. And we need to recognize that we have that freedom. The people who love freedom and who stand for freedom have the position of strength. And as long as we keep that, freedom will continue to ring in this country.
Thank you, Alberto. Joseph?
First of all, thank you, Julio. Thank you, panel. I mean, it's a great opportunity to listen to you and to see that we are like kind of on the same page. I don't want to repeat what they said, Jason and Alberto, but what I'm gonna try to say is a quick, stark difference between a Trump administration and a Biden administration on the foreign policy and domestically. Domestically, it's very clear we're gonna have a multiple Seattle and multiple New York, multiple cities that they're gonna be like Oregon or Washington State or New York City or New York State. We're gonna have them no matter what, because that's where the policies of these governors and mayors is gonna go on the external policy, international foreign policy. Then we're gonna have again the deal with Iran all over again. They're going to have normalization with Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, all these countries. They're going to come on board all over again. And then in the Middle East, I can't tell you the mess that it could happen, because if Iran is again fortified with an agreement and money and this, we're going to have a lot of at hands. And then the moral of the story is, if the United States is not strong, all democracies around the world, all minorities around the world, all oppressed people around the world feel threatened, regardless whether they have a relation or they don't have a relation with the United States, they like the United States or they don't like it. All these people, the moral support that a strong United States gives to all these countries is paramount for their survival, whether with intervention or without intervention. In the United States, we cannot let our guards down in here. Like Jason said, next 4 years, and I hope for the next 40 years, we need to teach it to our children, the children to their children and their friends. They need to be alert, because these people are not gonna quit. Every generation, we're gonna be subject to this invasion. So we need to teach it over and over again to be alert at all times.
Thank you, Joseph, so much. Otto, please.
Very briefly, let me just finish where I started. Two parts of the definition of Churchill's definition of socialism is the gospel of envy and the creed of ignorance. The problem we're having in the United States, and several of us have alluded to it, is frankly the ignorance on the part of too many of our fellow Americans. College graduates are leaving college not knowing who George Washington was, and I'm not exaggerating. I mean, there have been polls taken. The level of ignorance in the American higher education system is appalling, and when you have that kind of the ignorance combined with the expectation that they have received a valuable education and that the society owes them something, is a very dangerous combination. And so you have if you notice, most of the people in the streets today committing violence, not what NBC or CNN call peaceful protests, but the violent protests, which are the majority of them, are committed by young white kids, many of them graduates of some of our best universities. There were two lawyers in New York arrested for throwing Molotov cocktails into police cars in one of the riots in New York City recently. And these are graduates of not only good colleges, but good law schools. And yet they're perfectly willing to commit crimes that could cost people's lives. We have a very serious problem with our higher education system, and with frankly with the media. I can't start to give examples. Some of my jobs in government have dealt or had to do with confronting the misrepresentation of the facts and the policies, even going back to the Reagan administration. And it's amazing the ignorance of some of the press people. Even Ben Rhodes, who was the architect of the failed policy on Cuba, Ben Rhodes, who worked for Obama, made fun of the reporters. He said they were all 27 years old and didn't know anything, and you could tell them anything and they'd believe it. They'd report it. That's a very serious problem. A free and independent and professional media is one of the foundations of a free society. We don't have that today. We have to start restoring education, a real medium, of reporting. We have to reject some of the globalism, which a friend of mine in the State Department, a Real Foreign Service officer, called globaloni. China is an example of the failure of globalism. Everybody said, all we have to do is make China rich and wealthy, and then they will no longer be a threat. Well, they're more of a threat now than they have ever been, and they're more of a threat than Russia or Iran, who are very serious threats in and of themselves. Anyway, let me just stop there because I know we've gone way beyond our hour, and there's so much that we can talk about. And I want to thank Julio and his colleagues for putting this together.
Thank you, Otto. On behalf of Patria de Martí, I wasn't kidding when I said that we had a dream team here. You guys really are a dream team. You're a freedom dream team, and this kind of work, this kind of commitment, to a free society must continue at the ballot, but not just when we vote, but also in public, and constantly understand that freedom, an open society, a free society, and a republic that exercises democracy requires citizens that are capable of sustaining that democracy. And education, civic education, and understanding is super important if this is not done. So I feel, Patria Martí feels honored to have had this dream team together. Thank you, and I invite you back. I want to thank all of those that have been watching, the brilliant comments that they've been putting in Facebook and in YouTube. Please share this video. It will continue and serve, hopefully, its purpose of truly elevating consciousness. So we thank you all for being a part of it. We thank Jose Tarano, our technical producer, for everything. Thank you. God bless, and we'll see each other next time. Bye-bye.
Good night. Have a good night.
Thank you, Julio.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.